Thanks, Lindsay. Good afternoon, all, and welcome to Promoting and Assessing In-Class Participation Equitably. The equitably part is important. My name is Gavin Fromey, and I'm a graduate assistant with the Teaching and Learning team at the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning, who are facilitating this event. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Hannah Jardine. Hannah, you want to introduce your pronouns and title?
Sure. So I'm Hannah Jardine. I use she, her pronouns, a teaching and learning specialist, full-time with CTRL, and I also teach as an adjunct with the School of Education.
And with that, I think let's get started. Hannah is going to be piloting the slides today, so you'll hear me say next slide, please, whenever I finish a thought. So I guess next slide. Thank you. During this workshop, here we have some brief guidelines for participation. We ask that you please be present, as in participate in activities in a way that works for you. Ask questions and share ideas in the chat. We love to read the chat after the workshop, so please ask questions and post ideas. Use the raise hand function to speak. It will be under reactions in that bottom toolbar. And please be generous with your knowledge and respectful of others' knowledge. And next slide.
I think before the next slide, I did just want to mention too,
Yes.
If you've been to our events, you've seen these guidelines before, but particularly for this workshop, this is kind of a meta moment for us, and that it's an opportunity for us to model that when you do present guidelines for participation, like you might with your students or even create with your students, it can help to increase participation and make it very clear what you expect and how that's all going to work. So just a note there.
Very, very good point. There will be a lot of meta moments as we go through this, and that particular one will be brought up later. Thanks, Hannah. So to start us off, we'd like to start out with a warm-up. Yeah, so please, in the chat, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself and your department and share why you want students to participate in class? It seems like a very obvious kind of question, but sometimes it's the simple ones that have the most profound answers. So feel free to take a moment to think about that and post your answers. All right, starting to see some responses coming in. Teo Valdez says, I think that students learn the most when they engage together in the exploration of ideas. That's an excellent point. Brad Knight says, I want students to participate in class because it's essential for our inquiry-based curriculum. That is also a good point. The curriculum that we tend to design focuses on students, engaging very closely with the material, not just as absorbers of information, but also as askers of questions. We have Erica, who asks, who answers, I should say, they want students to be comfortable contributing their voices to class, as she believes that it benefits them and instructors as their and her as their classmate / instructor. Oh, excuse me, as it benefits their classmates and her, the instructor. Seeing a lot of responses relating to making sure that students are engaged with the material, that they're curious. Caroline notes to check for understanding, so it can also be a way of assessing student progress. That's an excellent point. And one thing I guess that I'm observing most is that there is a variety of reasons that folks have for wanting students to participate in class. And this will come up in our segment that you'll be hearing shortly on defining participation, but a preview of that is that participation is incredibly complicated in that there are so many ways to participate, and it really depends largely on what you want students to get out of the course, and that defines how you want students to participate. So with that, Hannah, would you like to go to the next slide? The outcomes for this workshop are, by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to define in-class participation broadly with a focus on equity. You'll be able to identify strategies to promote various forms of in-class participation, and you'll be able to develop a plan to assess participation equitably in your own courses. So you'll be able to understand how you want to construct a definition of participation, how to encourage students to participate in your course, and develop a plan for how you want to assess that type of participation you've defined. And with that, I believe, Hannah, it's your turn to take a crack at the first of those outcomes, defining participation.
Yeah, and before getting started with that, just also wanted to thank you all for your participation in the warm-up. You know, we start, I'd say, all of our workshops with some sort of warm-up or engagement activity, which is another thing that we like to model here. And the benefit to that is getting you actively engaged from the start, something you might do with your students as well. And we really appreciate the participation there. And hopefully you're learning from what your peers are writing as well. So defining in-class participation, how are we defining this? And why is it beneficial? So why is participation beneficial? A lot of these things that you mentioned in the warm-up, but we broke it down into kind of three main categories. First, that it improves learning. That certainly came up in your answers. So the more students interact with the material, the greater they retain that information, or the greater they're able to apply that information in future courses and future assignments and future class sessions. It improves their critical thinking and higher order thinking skills when they're, I saw words like grapple with the material or kind of dig deeper when they have to work together with their peers or with you in class, and promoting preparation and accountability to the material. It also improves sense of belonging. And I saw a few of you mention things that fit into this category. So improving relationships between students and between student and instructor, relationships being very critical to a student's academic success and their social sense of, feeling a sense of fit at the institution. Gaining diverse perspectives. I saw a lot of that in your comments through dialogue with peers, increasing interest in the discipline through personal connections. Personal connections meaning that students see themselves in the course, in the field, in the material, that you're helping them connect with the course content. And then lastly, it increases opportunities for feedback. And I think I saw a few people mention things along these lines. So where you as the instructor, the more students are participating in a variety of ways, you have more opportunities to monitor their learning and be responsive to that in the way you then proceed with the course content, how quickly you go through things, what you need to review, what you can maybe go a little bit faster with. And then students also build those skills of being able to self-assess and check in with their own learning, self-monitor, if they're being asked to engage during class and getting that feedback themselves. And now we're going to ask you to do a little participation to answer a few more questions about how we're defining participation. So before Gavin and I share our definition, we're interested to know what you think. And this is another kind of meta moment that we're modeling, in that getting students to participate in a class, giving them more agency or more kind of authority over the material by asking them for their definitions and the way they might be thinking of things both gives you a sense of where they're coming in and then also helps them to feel more connected to the material. So I believe Gavin put a link to the Jamboard in the chat. So there are 3 slides, one with the question, how do you define participation? One with a question, how do you think students define participation? And then the third one, maybe the most important right now as we go into this workshop, what challenges or concerns do you have about participation that hopefully we'll be answering for you today. So I'm actually going to open up the Jamboard and then switch screen sharing to that just so I can see how things are going. And then also, if anybody's new to Jamboard, I can show you how it works. So Jamboard is Google's kind of whiteboarding tool. See on this first slide, we have how do you define participation. See some people starting to add their sticky notes. So over here, you can click, you'll get a sticky note, and then you can type in, change the color if you'd like. We're not using the colors to necessarily indicate anything, but you have that option, and then you can move that around. So there are these 3 different questions. And feel free to move around to different ones. And then you'll see stop here for now because we're going to come back to the Jamboard later. But for now, just these 3 questions. So I'll give people about 3 or so minutes to add your ideas there. See someone looking to make it larger. Yeah, I can zoom in on my screen, and then you also have the option to zoom in on your own screens. See if going into 100 helps a little bit. And then also something to note, you can take, say, this sticky note that has a little bit more words. We can make it bigger so that we can read it better. Maybe about 1 more minute on the Jamboard and then start debriefing, seeing if there's some themes coming up. I think some of these got layered on top of each other. Again, Gavin and I purposefully designed this activity to model a way to do some interactive participation that didn't actually require you to, say, get into breakout rooms or get into small groups or even talk out loud, but that you're all able to contribute to the written conversation at least and have your ideas recognized and your voice heard. Something to note about Jamboard, since you all are joining as anonymous animals, we don't know necessarily who said what, and sometimes that's a benefit, and that students might feel more confident and comfortable sharing their ideas anonymously. But if you did want to know who said what, something that I would do in this situation is say, just put your initials on your Post-it note or something that in a very small way can indicate who said what. Right, I'll start let's start looking at what's here. I'm going to zoom in again. So how do you define participation? It seems like our definitions as instructors are very rich and varied and kind of all across the board, with everything from what's happening in class to even outside of class, because I noticed someone mentioning office hours or drop-in hours, that it's active thinking, taking notes during class, even being engaged with the material. That could look like asking questions, active listening. It's the foundation of building and creating community. So with this very varied definition and very broad definition, I think this is excellent. But I think the complicated thing is, how do we assess or measure things like active listening, like students are taking notes in a way that's synthesizing the information versus just transcribing passively? Or how do we measure active thinking? So those will be things we'll kind of go over as we go through the workshop today. Second thing to note, how do we think students define participation? Very noticeably different than the way we're defining it. A lot of talking and raising hands. So we'll also talk about moving away from that kind of limited mindset of what participation is, and how do we get students to think beyond that. And then, yeah, and that idea of speaking in class. And then lastly, seems like we also have a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to read over some of these. Ensuring marginalized voices feel safe and empowered. Making sure students have the opportunity to engage in different modes, for sure. And that's something we're certainly going to get into. That others, or that students see, like have different ways of expressing their ideas. Monopolizing the discussion. Some students feeling very much more comfortable talking and taking up that space and that time in the classroom. This is an interesting one, that sometimes our discussions just end up being us asking a really good question, students giving me really good answers, but they're all very individualized answers, and they're not necessarily actively engaging with each other's ideas or having discussions between themselves. All right, so all very important considerations and challenges that we will continue to address throughout today. I'm going to switch back to sharing the slides. And keep that Jamboard up for a little bit later in the workshop. All right, so something that we're very happy to be able to include in this presentation today is some student insights on participation. So these are all quotes that I took from my students last semester when I taught psychology of education, because we reflected on a lot of these things as they're learning about education and becoming future teachers, but also thinking about it as students. So this one, I'll read it out loud and then kind of debrief it. Participating in class does not mean just speaking up in class, but participating in class also means engaging with the material and participating in all activities during class session. I learn best when I can collaborate with others and also do independent work. I think it is really important to have a balance between the two, because working with others essentially builds community and learning from others, and working independently on in-class activities creates a deeper sense of the material. So this student, I think, is moving beyond that mindset of thinking about it as just talking, but that also comes from being really intentional and transparent about that being the expectation of the course, and defining it explicitly with students that participation does mean more than talking or speaking up in class. So that connects to this idea of all the different interactions students should have in their courses to have deep and meaningful learning. The three major pillars being the content. So that's getting into things that you all talked about, like active listening to the lectures, or active reading, note-taking, pre-class preparation, students interacting with the instructor. So how are they answering and asking questions of you? And then interacting with their peers, all three being critical for that successful learning experience. And something you might think about as we continue through this workshop is Are you thinking of all three of these points of interaction when you're thinking of how you're defining participation in your course? And are you making that explicit to students, and that it's not just about students performing participation for you as the instructor, but are they participating with content and with peers? So a few more quotes and ideas. One student says or wrote, "Considering my more quiet nature in the classroom, I hope that my classmates and professors notice that participation can look very different for different learners." I think we talked about that, or I noticed in your comments, and some of your challenges and concerns are that certain students are more shy or not really ready to speak up in that same way. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not actively listening, actively engaging with material, ready to participate in small group discussions. And then another student wrote, "When I am unmotivated, I will not participate, and my motivation is based on a variety of factors, mainly the ability to be seen figuratively in the classroom." So I think that also gets into a big focus of this workshop is, what is participation? What does it mean to design participation to be equitable and to give all students that sense that their ideas are valid, that their ideas are important, that they're represented and included in the course content and material and all the activities you do. So tying that all together, we present this equity-focused definition of participation. So that being, participation is a key part of the learning process, and therefore it should be aligned with your learning outcomes. I think Gavin will talk a little bit more about that, and we'll get to that when we get into assessing participation. That participation is more than attendance. It can come in many forms, not just speaking out loud, that it's very context dependent and maybe should be defined with students. So context dependent on who are the people in the room and what's important to them and what are their personalities and what skills do they bring. Context dependent on the course. Does the course have certain skill requirements, like is speaking or presenting in front of students or presenting in front of your peers one of your course learning outcomes, or a really important skill that students need to develop? And if that's the case, then participation might need to look a certain way. But if your course learning outcomes are more based on expression of understanding of content or knowledge of a content, then maybe that can be expressed in a variety of ways. It's a learned skill that should be taught and supported, and we'll talk about that in assessment as well, and that how can we help students improve their ability to participate in the ways that we expect. And then it increases when students feel comfortable and confident, and that sense of belonging and community. All right, so I think we're actually running a few minutes early, so I'll pause here and well, actually, no, we'll get into the chat check-in, because the pause is about what we just covered. And then we'll see if any questions come up as you're thinking about this question. I'll let Gavin introduce the chat prompt.
Sure. So please, if you'd be so kind, share in the chat, what ways might you be thinking about participation differently now than you did prior to this workshop? So thinking about those variety of ways that you can conceive of participation.
Anybody has questions at this point too, please share. I do want to recognize that Elizabeth had put a comment in the chat before that a lot of this is increasingly challenging when students are online with cameras off. And going back to camera policies, for those of us who are still teaching online or remote, there are many reasons why saying having a cameras on policy or requirement isn't very equitable, but there can still be maybe a conversation around how do we still create community with or without cameras? When should cameras be on, like in small groups, for example, or other ways to help students still feel a sense of being there together, even if they have their cameras off.
I like Teo's comment about working with students to define participation. We always encourage working with students because after all, the teaching and learning process incorporates learning. And since students are partners in that, it's good to hear their voices.
Jason, oh, sorry.
No, please go on, Hannah.
See Jason's comment earlier. This helps in finding better ways of assessing participation, and we do have a lot more content on that later in the workshop.
I like Matt's point there, and apparently Teo did as well, about how students may not come to class knowing how to participate. And so there is a need to build into class opportunities for students to learn the skills necessary to participate. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later in the workshop. A few people have noted that that three-way engagement, 3 points of engagement with content, instructors, and peers. I agree. It is a way to think about. It is a helpful way to think about how people can participate, not just in the instructor direction or in their student with their peers. Thinking about ways to incorporate all three, either concurrently or individually.
Jenny, thank you for sharing this very personal memory of what it was like for you to be a student. And I think a lot of our students feel similarly. And should we be grading students on their personality? Are we grading students on, their, feelings around talking in front of large groups of people? Again, not to say that there aren't contexts and courses in which it's important to develop the skill and the confidence of speaking in front of people, but that it shouldn't be the only way that we're assessing engagement and participation. Shed's, I think, including a bullet point that we have in one of the coming slides, privileging extroversion.
Elizabeth asks, but how do you assess peer-to-peer participation when the instructor is not present, such as in breakout rooms or outside of class?
We will be getting into assessment, in a little bit, and same with Natalie's question. We have some example rubrics coming up, so maybe this is a good cue to start moving on. I think people have a lot of questions that we will be getting to very soon.
Yeah, well, it's validating to hear that people are asking questions that we're going to be talking about. But always good to hear questions that we aren't, just in case. So now that we've talked a bit about how to conceive of participation or ways to think about how participation can take on all these different forms, let's think about how you might promote participation in your course. Hannah, could you go to the next slide, please? It may or may not come as a surprise to you that the process of promoting participation can occur before the course even begins. The primary way that you might promote participation is through including clear expectations on how you are defining and assessing participation through your course syllabus. So making a clear example in your course syllabus of how you define and assess participation in the course, and including resources on how students should prepare to participate. That can take the form of things such as tips on how to take notes when doing readings or sitting during lectures, or guidelines for participating in group work. So making sure that students are prepared with how they should be participating, so that they understand what you expect of them and they know how to do it. You should also be considering how participation fits into your larger grading schema. And this comes into the point after that of ensuring alignment between your participation expectations and the learning outcomes and assignments for the course. Hannah will be talking a little bit more about assessing participation later on, but we always like you to keep in mind that participation shouldn't be a thing that you expect students to do for its own sake, although it does have its benefits. Always be thinking about how does participation enhance students' achievement of the learning outcomes for the course. So if a learning outcome says that students will be able to well, gosh, now that I'm blanking on potential learning outcomes, but they will be able to compose a research paper on a given topic. Think about, well, how does participation serve that learning outcome? What will students need practice with during class, and what participation activities will help them achieve the learning outcomes? A thing to also keep in mind is that when you're choosing your course readings and multimedia for the course, think about the ways that you can choose them to promote student interest and motivation in the course content. As we know, students that are more interested in the course content are more motivated to learn and therefore more motivated to participate. If you're not sure exactly what interests students in your course content, there are a few ways that you can learn that yourself. One is by talking with students on the first day of class or early in the semester about why they're choosing to take your course and what interests them about the course content. You can also do an informal poll or survey through Canvas that students can fill out during class or outside of class. Both are good strategies just to get a sense of why students are taking your course so that you can develop exercises and activities and reading and assignments that will engage them in the material and hopefully pique their interest and motivation. I think next slide, Hannah. Now, when it comes to promoting participation during class, we have two large categories that we think of. Most people tend to think of participation in the form of speaking. I think that's the classic way that we tend to conceive of participation. But consider what ways can speaking contribute to the student's achievement of the learning outcomes. I told you we'd be hammering this point home. Speaking can be good for its own sake, as folks have noted. It can be a way of tracking student learning. It can be a way of ensuring that they are paying attention and understanding the material. However, speaking can also be a way of ensuring that students are making progress towards their learning outcomes. The classic example of speaking participation would be answering and asking questions, but it can also take the form of think, pair, share, or turn and talk activities. That's where students are given a prompt and then they turn to their neighbor and talk it over with them. It can take the form of small group discussions, contributing to cooperative lab assignments, or student-led discussions or presentations. Now, we've talked a bit about how participation can take many forms, and that doesn't mean that speaking shouldn't be one of them. Speaking is a perfectly valid form of participation, but we encourage you to consider speaking as just one aspect of participation. The goal of these types of exercises are to encourage variety. Variety in participation expectations is a way to improve equity because not all people want to speak, but because some do, it's important to include that as well. As Hannah noted earlier, though, keep in mind that when you are asking students questions, it should be the goal to encourage the entire class to participate rather than having it just be a one-way conversation between you and the students. Thinking of it as that peer interaction, how you can incorporate peer interaction into your questions for the class. Next slide, please. Some more quotes from Hannah's education course that we think help illustrate these points. The first, I think as I participated in more small group discussions, I became more comfortable in being able to share with the entire class. Another quote, at the beginning of the semester, I had more challenging time speaking my voice in smaller group activities, and I was pretty shy to engage with my peers. But the more I was in groups, the more encouraged I felt to talk and engage in discussions. So thinking of this diversity of ways that students can participate, even through just speaking activities, can help students feel more comfortable in engaging in other forms of participation. Some ways this variety can help reinforce each other. Speaking participation can help reinforce written participation and vice versa. Next slide, please. Which takes us to the other category of promoting in-class participation, writing. You might consider what ways can writing contribute to students' achievement of the learning outcomes. But like I said, writing can also be a way for students to have an artifact of the speaking that they were doing. So if students are asked a question about a specific aspect of the course content and they provide a verbal response, consider writing as a way for them to also track that same response, but now they've got a physical art or they've got an artifact that can help them that they can refer back to in the future to say, well, for example, the Jamboard. We asked a question and you all wrote your responses in, but now after the fact, after the session is completed, you can refer back to the Jamboard and read your peers' responses and potentially gain new insights from it. So writing can have its own benefits as well as being a way to augment your variety and participation. Some ways that you can think of participation or examples of participation can include minute papers or exit tickets. These take place at the end of class and are usually in the form of a brief response to a question prompt provided by the instructor. They can take the form of Jamboard or Google Docs, as we've seen. Chalk talks, in which students write silently or on posters around the room. Pass the paper, in which students answer questions in writing and pass it to a peer, or as polls or quizzes. All of these can be ways that students can participate through writing. And you can also see how a verbal component could be added to each and every one of them if you desired to further augment the variety and participation. And next slide, please.
Yeah, I think I was going to add to that last point that you made. Even though we separated out speaking and writing, there are times where you might imagine this writing is helping you to assess what came out of a student discussion. So for example, your exit ticket might be summarize 3 key takeaways you got from the small group discussions you had throughout class today. Or vice versa, and that students might write first and then have a discussion about what they wrote, or you might have a poll and then have a discussion about that. So they're certainly interacting with each other and reinforcing each other.
Exactly. Thinking about a variety of ways that students can participate. So now we'd like to return to the Jamboard. I'll post the link again in the chat. This time we'd like you to go to, I believe it's the 5th, 6th, and 7th slides, respectively, and post your responses to the questions. What strategies do you use or want to use to promote participation before the course begins, through speaking, as well as through writing? So please take a moment to post your responses to those, and then we'll check back in and see what y'all wrote.
I will share again, just so we see where we're at. So we had said stop here for now, but then there are 3 more slides back here with more questions. So Of course, we just shared a bunch of strategies, so this is your chance to maybe get into more specifics that have worked for your context, or other ideas that Gavin and I might have missed. So this would be anything to do with syllabus or course design, speaking and writing. So we'll give you some, maybe 5 minutes or so to put your ideas there. And also to note, there's a really great conversation, and we love when this happens between a few people in the chat around different reasons to assess participation, different forms of self-assessment, which we will talk about a little bit in a few minutes in this workshop, but extremely important points that all of this is very, very context dependent, very nuanced, very complex. And maybe we should have said that earlier in the session, and I know it'll come up when we start talking about assessment, is that there really are no right answers. There are maybe wrong answers, but it's really everything depends on the course, your students, the context, the discipline, departmental norms and expectations, even all sorts of things. So this is just our attempt to give you a whole number of things to think about and then fit that. And also the importance of just iteration and trying out things.
And the order that we chose to explain things is also theoretically a good order to undertake. So trying to define participation in the context of your course is probably going to be your first step. And then thinking about whether or not this is something that how to promote that, how to explain that to students, how to work on it cooperatively with students, and then come to a decision about how or if it should be assessed. So although there are many, many, many ways you could do this, that is one good one that we came up with.
A lot of really, really great ideas already coming in. I think we'll still take a few more minutes to give you a chance to add your ideas, read what your peers are writing. Right, well, feel free to continue to add ideas to the board, but I think Gavin and I will start seeing what's coming up here and debriefing some of your ideas. Zoom in a little bit. So strategies used before the course and in the course design. I see this is a great idea, offering specific examples of what participation looks like. So not just being clear about your expectations, but actually providing models. And that might be a model for written participation or speaking, explicit in that syllabus language, defining it, linking to it objectives like we've been saying, outlining those guidelines, this idea of participation logs throughout the semester. And that's in some ways a form of self-assessment, and you might even collect that and give them a grade for submitting that or doing that. Being very clear in the syllabus about what participation is, asking students to self-reflect again, using Slack, so using other tools for out-of-class community building and participation. Anything else, Gavin, you see on this slide we should talk through?
No, I think I like most of I like all of the examples listed here. I think that it's the points that I want to emphasize are probably on the other two slides.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So strategies for participation through speaking.
So lots of small group work is going to be a fan favorite. Having collaborative learning techniques or opportunities for that peer-to-peer interaction. I think that one point that I really wanted to emphasize based on these responses is that ultimately the connection or the degree of connection between the form of participation that you want students to provide and the learning outcomes for the course, it can either be very direct or it can be somewhat more theoretical or somewhat more a little bit fuzzier. So for example, if you're teaching a course in which one of the learning objectives involves lab work, then obviously having students participate in labs is going to be an integral part of that, and it's going to be very direct. However, some of the other things like participating in group work and giving students an opportunity to talk through course content, it may or may not directly relate to a specific learning outcome, but it will nevertheless enhance students' achievement of the overall learning outcomes. And so the choices of participation that you make are not necessarily going to be uniform. It could be something that is directly related to a learning outcome, or it could be something that you believe will promote students' achievement of the learning outcomes, if that distinction makes sense. So I love the examples that I'm seeing, but the difference between them is in my mind. It's at the front of my mind. So I like the diversity of ways that people are arriving at that.
I think something that I really love here that I want to recognize is this idea of acknowledgement and letting students know that you notice their participation. And maybe that goes back to sharing these examples. So whoever wrote this, I love this idea of writing one email to every student, thanking them for something they said in class, acknowledging their ideas. That can just really make them more confident to continue to speak up, or more excited and committed to speaking up, building that rapport. And same thing here with highlighting contributions and asking for follow-up. So I know many instructors who, ideally cold calling isn't happening, in that we're not just asking questions and saying, you answer, but that when you're cold calling on someone and referencing something they maybe already have written in a discussion board or in some other class assignment, or that you heard, them saying in small group discussion before coming back as a whole class, will give them the confidence to then answer, and I think is a way to validate their ideas. So absolutely that idea of acknowledgement going on here. And then lastly, let's talk about writing. So yeah.
Oh, no,
ahead.
please. I was just going to note, there's some examples that were shared in the slides, but also, discussion boards, the online or the asynchronous forms of participation are also valid. One person asks, I'm interested in hearing ideas about how to encourage students to participate in discussions, perhaps also to make them into more active conversations than just posting. I think that gets back to what we were talking about choosing questions or topics that will engender student interest. And make them excited to participate and excited to discuss the subject with their peers. What are your thoughts, Hannah?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think both interest and choice. So I've found a lot of success in when I give students, say, like, choose one of these 3 TED Talks to watch, or choose one of these 3 articles to read. And what ends up happening usually is across the class, it's never even, but students will choose different ones. And then that also makes them more interested in reading their peers' posts, because they'll look for someone who watched a different video than them and then be able to say, oh, like, I really learned from reading your summary of that, even though I didn't get a chance to watch it. So they like having choice, and then they're more interested in reading things that they maybe didn't get a chance to engage with themselves. All right, but yeah, the idea of this out of class participation on the discussion board, I think that also touches on a comment that came up earlier about accountability to students being prepared, and that a lot of instructors will utilize discussion boards and out of class assignments to hold students accountable to having done the readings, and then also thinking through the readings.
And it also ties into the idea that not all students come to class knowing how to engage in discussion boards or what the expectations are. And that may be something that you need to explain to students or have a conversation with them about, to make sure that they are fulfilling your expectations for participation that you've expressed to them.
All right, well, again, thank you all for your participation. And now we're going to close things up with some information about our thoughts around assessing participation, which again is maybe the most complex part of all of this, right? We can all maybe agree that it's great to have a variety of participation, but then how do we measure that? Do we grade it? How do we grade it? What do we do with that? So that's why we're starting with questions to consider, because there are a lot of questions to consider here. First, are you assessing compliance or learning? And that we'd highly encourage you to think about assessing learning and how to move your approach towards that. So are students participating because they're motivated to learn and they see the connection and the relevance to achieving the course learning outcomes, or because they're afraid of losing points? And this gets into extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And motivational theorists will often argue that you need to have an extrinsic motivator at first to maybe build intrinsic motivation. And that assigning points is a way to help students see the value for their learning. And that is a completely, I think, fair and still equitable argument, but that it shouldn't be only because they're afraid of losing points. And then what learning outcomes are you assessing? Are you assessing product or process? Are you grading for accuracy or effort? So there's not necessarily a right or wrong here, but just something to be thinking about. And then are you providing feedback to students on how they can improve? And then lastly, are you assessing or tracking each instance or holistically? Like some instructors will say check off every attendance or participation in class is worth 1 or 0.5% of your grade for each class that we have, or something like that, versus overall it's worth 20% of your grade. This is how many classes you can miss without an excuse, or this is how you'd make up for missed classes, or this is how we're grading it over this period of time, versus checking off every time. Again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It might depend on your preference or what you think works best for you and your students. But again, something to think about. And also wanting to note here that things like rewarding behavior or compliance or performance or even attendance only versus participation can lead to structural inequities in who is successful and who has access to that. And I think the idea of bias has come up a lot in the chat conversation I've been noticing. So some other arguments that we've seen from reading the literature and following other people in our positions on other campuses having these same conversations is there's many arguments for whether or not to even grade participation, no versus yes. And so we kind of set up this table in that each row, the argument for no is sort of the counter argument for yes. But in the end, we'll say too, it's your choice as the instructor. And it's somewhat of a philosophical dilemma in some of these cases. Your departments or schools might also have strong opinions about this, or might benefit from having discussions with your colleagues about how they approach this. Again, we're not proposing necessarily a right answer, but different sides of the argument, trying to see equity on both sides. So in that, we might say we shouldn't grade for participation because we want to focus on building that intrinsic motivation, that students shouldn't need to be micromanaged, that grades shouldn't be used to solve classroom management problems, or that participation is the practice and preparation for assignments that will be graded, but shouldn't be graded itself. The argument for yes is that we're recognizing and rewarding student activities that contribute to learning. This idea of using extrinsic motivation to build intrinsic motivation really helps students to build those skills and to recognize what's important. Students learning how to learn, and we should support them in developing skills of prioritization, preparation, and time management by incentivizing this. Excuse me. And that also participation is evidence of learning and therefore should be graded if we're grading and assessing learning. Let me just say all of these, again, hard to say necessarily what is absolutely fitting for you in your context. Might also depend on what level of student you're working with, and that it's more important to grade student participation for first or second year students, but maybe not in graduate school is another argument we certainly hear. I'm looking at the chat to see if there's anything to come up. I think, Brad, is your question for us or for those who are speaking in the chat?
For you.
Okay. So how is this further complicated by absences, excused or unexcused? I guess, well, so are you saying like grading participation, but considering that, for example, at a time where students are likely to be sick throughout the semester at some point, and that is certainly an excused absence, are we requiring them to make up the participation they might have missed that day, or just kind of let it go and then they demonstrate participation in other classes? So participation is based on what you're seeing from them when they are present. Should we have a limit on absences, excused or unexcused? Well, certainly there's no limit on excused absences, but there does come a point in the course where you might have a conversation about students needing to take it incomplete, for example. I don't know, Brad, do you have any comments too to add? I know that you
Yeah,
think a lot about this.
sure. So I'm thinking about both whether or not the practices or policies of a course are implicated, and also the question of learning is replicable when a student is not participating or hasn't participated in a course discussion or participation. It's really, participation isn't a solitary thing in my conception of it in most cases. And so there are implications both for how you structure participation's means of assessment and modes of like accomplishing it. And I've been getting a lot of questions about the interaction of attendance policy and participation policy. And so that was, I was interested if you had thoughts, if you all had anything to offer on that.
But it's certainly, if you might, do you mind, Hannah?
No.
It certainly seems like it would be a question that coheres well with the idea of directional participation, as in who is this part? As you say, participation isn't just with oneself, it's with an external source. So is it with the course content, with other students, your peers, or is it with the instructor? Now, obviously, being absent from class would preclude your ability to participate with your peers during class. However, if you were to assign, for example, online discussion forums, that might be an opportunity for a student to engage with their peers. Otherwise, as an instructor, if a student has plenty of excused absences in which they are unable to participate with their peers in these kinds of conversations, and you have no means of incorporating discussion forums outside of class, then you might consider providing an opportunity for that student to discuss the content with you, either through in-person or virtual office hours, or through an alternate means of demonstrating that they're just providing a space for them to express what they're thinking about with the material, maybe asking them a series of questions through email that they can ponder and answer. There are a variety of ways, synchronously and asynchronously, that one can participate. And although the quality, we can discuss the quality of in-person versus asynchronous participation. But if you're looking to just provide them a space to participate, there are certainly a variety of ways that can be considered. That would be my thought. What about you, Hannah?
Yes, and I think again, why we were excited, both excited to have this workshop, but also I think the more we put it together, the more we realized there are just so many complex questions and nuances in all of this. We've read through many of a debate in the ed development community. And that I think we also welcomed this as an opportunity to have some of these debates. So thank you. And I see Elizabeth has her hand up. You're still on mute.
To follow up on Brad's question, because I've been grappling with this both in class and online, is that I'm I guess arrogant enough to believe that my classroom model and banding together in a group has value, and that I'm not trying to offer a correspondence course. And so while I want to give multiple avenues of participation, if I have too many offline avenues and take into account too much out of the classroom exercises of participation, then it can discourage enough of a critical mass to get the kinds of exercises that I want to do and that I'm going to have students do in the classroom, to meet their competencies and their learning objectives. And so, what I got into, and it came to sort of a critical head, I was so happy that you were having this thing, because I had some students saying, okay, how are you defining participation? And my definition kept getting longer and longer, and as they do in your syllabi in terms of what doing it, and more contingencies. But I'm getting more and more students, and I think it's somewhat of a pandemic response, saying, well, I wasn't there that much, but when I did, I really participated well. And sometimes that's true. They did. They were insightful, they were respectful, they were prepared the 3 times they were there out of the 14-week semester, and it's like, but because of all that, there's something of a shared responsibility. I'm not the only one in the room who's supposed to be doing the teaching. It should be a collaborative exercise, and expecting that students, I think of all levels, are participating in order to share both the learning and the teaching as part of it. And I don't have a problem with that in terms of the experiential or learning objectives. The problem I have with that is putting it into a rubric that is giving fair notice to the students in a syllabus at the beginning in terms of, what to do it, both in terms of, participation in class is easy. I see the first rule of participation in class is your body has to be in the chair. Your body's not in the chair, you're by definition not participating in the classroom. And then you get into excused or inexcused absences. Online, they tend to just sort of log in, and half of the time I think they're going back to sleep, because when we go into breakout groups or things, they're not there, and their fellow students get annoyed. So I'm interested in terms of seeing your rubrics and reacting to that, because I really am concerned as we expand this definition that we still encourage people to come to class and have a learning environment in the classroom.
I think just seeing the time and seeing we were about to show some rubrics, so maybe we will move on to that. I think this is an important conversation to be continuing to having with sharing some of these materials with colleagues and using these as prompts for further conversation. Just quickly to go through what we have here, and we'll be sharing these slides as well. So if I'm going quickly, I apologize. There's so many options, right, too, for rubrics, checklists, or other tools to track and assess participation. We talked earlier about process versus product. So if you're assessing the process, you might assign each student a participation score based on preparedness, engagement, learning activities, versus the product or an artifact of learning. You might be assigning each student a score on an activity that measures the learning they achieve through that participation. So a problem set, a case study, a quiz, a question that summarizes key concepts from that day. Using spreadsheets or Canvas to keep track of scores for each class, and then assigning grades based on averaging over time or considering a certain number of drops or exemptions. And that gets back into that absences question. For larger classes, so that's often a challenge we hear from people too. Some strategies I've heard people use is, say, randomizing who will be graded for participation in a certain day. So if you have 80 students or 40 students, you might only grade a random sample of 20, but they don't know who that's going to be. So then they're encouraged to always be a part of that participation. But then there are some challenges with that as well. In terms of rubrics, there are a few different models. And again, these examples will be in the slides of a holistic, which would be you're just grading, was your participation meeting expectations sort of there or not at all acceptable, on a completely holistic level, versus having checklists where you're separating out things like, were you prepared? Did you contribute? Did you interact with your peers? Where students might be scoring differently in those different criteria. And then that big part about student self-assessment, which certainly was coming up in the chat, this idea of supporting students' reflection and growth in relation to participation. Can you ask them to evaluate their own participation over the course of the semester? So some ideas for that might be early in the semester, asking students to assess their adherence to the expectations in the syllabus, asking students to reflect on how they've attended to class norms and expectations, asking them to consider how their participation has improved and what they might take with them to future classes. This could be done on paper as a quiz on Canvas, excuse me. So again, there's still a debate around whether this is appropriate. There's certainly, as I think you mentioned, Elizabeth, bias around what students are comfortable giving themselves A's and not giving themselves A's. And is that really fair? So it requires a lot of transparency and clarity when having these conversations with your students. I see Natalie asking, we'll be sharing these slides exactly, so you'll have access to these rubrics. And a lot of thank you also for other people sharing ideas in the chat to supplement this conversation. Some closing quotes from students I want to leave you with. So I feel that this class, along with my other classes this semester, pushed me to participate more and share my own thoughts. And this is something I've always struggled with, but enjoyed getting the chance to work on that. We shared this to just highlight this idea that like, we're there to help our students develop these skills and give them opportunities for practice and growth. And whether or not you grade student self-assessment or even grade participation in general, having those opportunities for self-assessment are still valuable. And then participating, the second quote, participating in the larger class discussion a few times, which was a goal of mine. So when you ask students to be more self-aware, then they're more likely to push themselves in future classes and hold themselves accountable to their own goals that they might have set for themselves. So just some key takeaways to leave you with, and I believe Lindsay should be dropping a feedback link in the chat, that an equity-focused approach to participation facilitates contributions from all students rather than being limited to behaviors related to privilege and extroversion, recognizes participation as an ongoing informal assessment that helps us and students to monitor, grow, and improve over time, and then requires us to define, promote, and assess participation by working with students, and I think with each other too, as this showed. Gavin and I put drew from a lot of resources to put this together, but there's no, that's not to say that this is a complete definition for participation that isn't well informed by all the ideas that you all bring to this session. So again, thank you for your participation and for joining us. I'm going to put this on the closing slide. I think, yeah, Victoria, so a student that works with CTRL, put a link to a survey for you all to get some feedback, so that we have feedback from you about how the session went and what else you might want to see in regards to this topic, especially. Potentially a follow-up workshop. Gavin shared the slides with you all in the chat, and we will also send a follow-up email with those slides and some additional resources that came up. And as you all may know, we're always available for one-on-one consultations about participation, say in your specific course context. We have other upcoming events and resources related to this. Thank you for joining. Gavin, any last thoughts?
It's a learning process, and every cohort of students is going to be different. So don't be discouraged if it's challenging to get a particular group of students to participate to the standards that you expressed. I just encourage you all to have courage and be patient and have empathy for students.